Discussion is titled Indo-Portuguese Literary Imprint. To chair this session, may I invite Professor Kenneth David Jackson, Professor of Portuguese at Yale University, United States of America. For those of you who may have missed Professor Jackson's keynote address yesterday, I should emphasize that he specializes in Portuguese and Brazilian literatures, modernist, vanguardist, and inter-arts literature, ethnomusicology, and Portuguese culture in Asia. His research on Portuguese literature and culture in Goa was supported by the American Institute of Indian Studies and undertaken at the Xavier Center for Historical Research. Professor Jackson is a recipient of the Vasco da Gama Medal, Portugal, and the Ordem de Rio Branco Award, Brazil. He has authored several books, including Goa, a Post-Colonial Society Between Cultures, Machado de Assis, A Literary Life, Portugal, As Primeiras Vanguardas, and dozens of other anthologies and publications whose titles I will not name because I dare not pronounce them. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome with a thunderous round of applause the convener of today's conference and the chair of this panel, Professor Kenneth David Jackson. I hand the floor over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to hear that I cover so many unpronounceable titles. Welcome everyone to our last panel of the two-day conference, India-Portugal, Confluence of Cultures. After hearing such interesting and fascinating examples of the confluence of cultures and sometimes conflicting conflicts of cultures in the last panel, this panel is meant to complement by showing the reflections of Goan culture in primarily literature, but also in other arts such as theater, music, and dance. The key words for the last panel include reflections, descriptions, perspectives, and expressions. The various ways in which Goan culture is put forward, described, and expressed through literary text, but also in other arts, theater, music, and dance. So it's my honor now and pleasure to call to the dais the participants, beginning with Dr. Sharmila Pais. Dr. Sharmila Pais is Associate Professor in the Department of History in St. Xavier's College, Nassau. She was awarded a doctorate for research on electoral studies in colonial Goa. She was also author of The Encounter with the Ballot in Colonial Goa and co-author of The Quest for Goa. She's edited poem Folk Stories, published in 2024, last year, and has contributed chapters to textbooks, the textbook curriculum on Goan studies. Her title for today is Artistic Expressions Reflected in the 19th Century Indo-Portuguese Literature, Theater, Music, and Dance. Welcome, Dr. Mira. Now I'd like to call Dr. Rama Murkunda. Dr. Rama Murkunda is Assistant Professor in Konkani at Goa University. Her doctoral research is on translating Konkani short stories and novels with a linguistics perspective. She's written for Konkani dailies and is editor of various titles of children's literature published over the last several years. A translator. Her main areas of interest are language teaching and translation. And today she will be presenting on depiction of Portuguese rule in Konkani novels. Welcome, Dr. Murkunda. Next, I'd like to invite Inês Portaz de la Cerda. Inês holds a master's in contemporary studies from the University of Lisbon and is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Yale University. Her research explores connections between the Portuguese-speaking world and Asia from the early modern era to the present. She's prepared a project on women's writers and how writing by women reconfigures remnants of Portuguese colonial empire. And she's continuing her studies of writing in Portuguese Asia stemming from Goa, particularly Japan, which is one of her specialties. Today she'll be speaking on perspectives of Goa and India in contemporary Portuguese literature. Welcome, Inez. And our next speaker, Dr. Rochelle Fernandez. Rochelle Fernandez is assistant professor in the discipline of English at Goa University. She's a PhD student in the Department of Humanities and Social Science. Her research interests include memory studies, Indian Ocean studies, and Goan historical and literary studies. And today she will be presenting on A Chink in the Facade, Slavery and Social Decay in Joseph Hurtado's Golden Goa. So, as I was mentioning before, the whole idea of depiction, reflection, perspectives, and expression unites the papers that you'll be hearing and the projects to be presented. So I'd like to invite, keeping in mind, of course, our time restrictions, invite everyone to present their topic and a kind of resume for 10 to 15 minutes, beginning with Dr. Sharmila Bass.
Respected Chair. Check. Respected Chairperson, Professor Jackson, Professor Anuradha Wagle, Dhruv, Lorraine, I'm very happy to be associated with this conference. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk today on a topic which is still under research. But it's something that I've really got myself acquainted in the last 10 years, and it's something which I'm just enjoying myself. After a hearty meal, I think we all need some drama and theater in our lives, and I hope this keeps us more refreshed and engaging. My topic, as you can see, is theater, music, and dance. Now, when I say theater, it should not be really misrepresented. It's actually teatro, best explained in Portuguese, música e dança. This is the two other arts which they are actually accompaniments to theater. And I'm not referring to theatre, which became popular genre much later towards the end of the, towards the last quarter of the 19th century. This is an art which is little known in the circles of Goa. That's what I feel when I've spoken to a lot of people, my contemporaries who have worked on the Konkani theatre. It was about a decade ago that I came across during my doctoral research that there was another genre of entertainment culture in colonial Goa, and that was the theatre. When I use the word reflections, they are actual reflections, not really an analysis of the theatre, because my sources are largely the Boletim do Governo or Boletim Oficial, which reported every nitty-gritty of what was happening in colonial Goa. The area of research is the 19th century. Now, this was a watershed event in the history of colonial Goa because there were so many things that were happening. You have the constitutional regime spanned over nearly a century, and a lot of changes that were that saw during this period. It was not a very uniform phase. There were ups and downs. There were conflicts between the liberals and the conservatives. So although it was named as a liberal period, there were also conflicts. And amidst all of this, we have something called as the emergence of the bourgeois class, a new societal culture and technology, of course. Now, technology comes in much later with transport and communication, and it's indirectly associated over here. One also sees shifts in artistic expressions because from the earlier phases of colonial history, 17th and the 18th century, we are moving away from religiosity. You have the free
Masonic movement that was taking place in Portugal, and you see its imports over here, which reflected in theatre. So you see a kind of a modernity and semblance of the European theatre culture that is reflected over here, which I wish to bring about. Influences of Portugal and the countries that I've listed here. France, the influence of France was very, very persistent. Italy, Dutch, Spain, sometimes there are references to even Russia and some of the African countries. Now this special, if you read now this is a quote somewhere in around 1856, which appears in the Bulletin do Governo, and it says, of the lack of entertainment in Panjim, it says, now who writes this? It's one of the spectators who writes in the Bulletin do Governo, and it's just one of its kind that I found. Generally, you don't find expressions or opinions of people, but this was something that a person writes over here. He says, once at 7 o'clock, everything is so dull in Panjim, and there's lack of entertainment. But what actually cuts, this kind of a very a dull life, sometimes an occasional ball, or you have some theatrical performances. So which shows that the people in Nova Goa or modern day Panjim were looking forward to entertainment. And this is precisely the 19th century. So much of it, now why did this happen over here? As I mentioned earlier, in Portugal, there were a lot of changes that had occurred. Dona Maria II, she was the Queen of Portugal then, and she herself, being a liberal queen that she was, had started a art culture in Portugal. And you see among the, even among the royalty of Portugal, there was this trend where the monarch, accompanied by the royal family, would go to these national theatres. And a similar trend is also reflected here in Goa, where the bureaucrats, the governor general, the Luso descendants, the Portuguese administrators who would attend and really would have some kind of a leisure time over here. Now you can see this, there are a few clippings which I wish to show, which tell you a few aspects over here. This is not the first one, but this is the, the easiest that I could get before my presentation. So you have something called as Teatro Particular. União was the name of the theatre based in Nova Goa. And that tells you a few things which I will discuss later since I have less time at my disposal. There was this another one here, Teatro Particular Dom Fernando, which was, once again, the name itself was probably commemorating the King of Portugal, Dom Fernando II. You have another theatre space, and that was Harmonia, not Club Harmonia in Margam, but rather in Mapsa. Teatro Esperança. Now, interesting. Now, this was in Ponda. Besides this one, there were more also in Ponda. Now, Restauração. Now, this was in surprisingly in Kasauli. Now, I'm surprised because there is a reason why it was staged. I sometimes wonder why. Because the other places that I've mentioned, they have a reason. You have a lot of Luso descendant population who were instrumental in bringing these arts to the public. A little later, you have Teatro Lusitano, which was another theatrical space. Okay. Now, these are the list of theatre spaces that existed in various parts of Goa, not everywhere. As I mentioned to you, there was this particular crowd or population which desired to view and have some kind of an entertainment. And now, except for all of these, except for Ponda, Bisholi, then Mapsa, there was a fair section of the Luso descendants who were instrumental in bringing about these theatre, rather dramas on stage. And Kansauli, you don't really find, even the last statistics that I've got managed somewhere in the mid-19th century, I've not found any Luso descendant settlers in Kansauli village. So this actually is quite baffling to me, and maybe in due course of time I'll be able to find out what is the reason for that. Now these are some of these theatres which existed. Now what are the features that, having studied, now this is a research work which span across from all the bulletins which I could get. The earliest one was in 1838, but then there was no teatro but from Xavier Center of Historical Research, so I've been able to work at least for about 20 years on these I mean, the kind of research spanning across 20 years of these, this data over here. Now, these were private and secular spaces. They were not government funded, because they had to manage their own funds, and sometimes you come across instances where they were having financial difficulties and asking for people to cooperate, the board members to cooperate and pay their necessary dues. There were members of the board. Tickets were available, and usually most of these dramas, they were staged either on Saturdays or maybe on Tuesdays. Now that is the time where the Bulletin du Govind would be published. Initially the bulletin was, weekly, but later when it becomes bi-weekly, they were advertised twice. There were family-oriented dramas, because some of these advertisements, they make a mention that even a child could come and attend. So if it was a family gathering, it was, there was a, if it was a single person, it was priced at so much. A family, a child, there was some kind of discount. So you know that they were, many of them, most of them, in fact, they were meant for families. Then presence of male actors. No way did I find the presence of Goan ladies in acting, except in case of foreign influences, where you have foreign actors, not too often, but in case of French influences, we do have a lady who was a professional, and she toured not only Goa, but also across British India. So she and her troupe actually presented over here. The Teatro Unia was one of the most happening theatre space. That was because it was the capital of the territory, and most of the happening dramas would take place here. You see this French, when I mentioned about the foreign influence, now you have this, I cannot but give an example of this, a drama that was staged in 1857, and you see total French influence over here. It was a French ballet, various dances, Ariège, and a comic sketch that you could, the title itself, a farcical act, which was once again, bespeaks of the French influence. Here there are some examples over here that talk of the French influence in their names as well. This was in Ponda. Once again, you have the French influence reflected here, Spanish influence from the name Ugalushu, which is once again Spanish. Okay. Now to talk about the structure of the drama, you notice that every dramatic act was followed by a satire. The drama was in so many acts, 3 acts, 2 acts, 4 acts, but it always had a satire or a comedy or a pantomime or a mime. Sometimes there were poetry. Now in one instance, there was this magical act, and a magical act performed by, I was a little baffled by the name, but sounded like, very much like an Indian name. Now this one here, Upaj in the Alju Barota, it is a historical play, one of the earliest plays. And what is very interesting about this play is that it was a very popular play in Brazil, in Lisbon, and in Goa. And it played for almost 4 years, first in Nova Goa, then Mapsa, then Ponda. From this year till 1858, you hear of this play. This was a historical play. And it was an enactment of a very influential person in Portugal, José Real, if I get his name. But reading his biography, you know that he's one of the theatrical figures, a poet, a writer, all blended in one. So this was, something that was. So what I'm trying to share that some of these such well-known plays from different corners of the world were also staged over here. You have a second one, Roberto Chev de Salteadores. Now this is something that I'm trying to find out, what is the reason for Roberto Chev de Salteadores? Because when you study the political history of Goa, and I having a background for my doctoral research, having worked on the elections of Goa, I come across Deepaji Rane, Chev de Salteadores. That means Deepu Rane, the chief of the rebels, he has contested the elections. And see the date of this drama, it's around 1854. Deepaji Rane revolt, as we know, was, it happened in 1852. So I was wondering whether it had some connection, or you tried to, present this drama. Was it on his life? Unfortunately, I'm not I have not been able to gather information because the Bulletin do Governo doesn't give you any information on the text except for the first drama, Upajendu Albujarota, that the first battle. It just gives you the list of the names, and probably from the names you just have to derive, unless you find some sources which throw more light on. So these are some of the various dramas that were. And now you pay attention to the comedies there. You know, they actually speak of the humor, the titles itself, they talk of the humor, the pretending dead hunter, the mischievous daughter, the baron's daughter, the dinner guest, take off your pants, Poles and Russians in Moravia. So you have, various mimes. There are also references to some mimes which were enacted, the faking dead hunter, and it reminds us so much of, the contemporary mimes. Comedies, these are just a few examples that I have presented here. O Morgado, which is actually a Nobel title, and it was, the title of the Morgado, it was a kind of a financial award, a title of nobility that was even prevalent in Goa and Portugal. Now, as far as music and dance is concerned, I'm not going to get into the genre of music, trying to trace the history of music in Goa, which of course has long history, and I'm sure it requires a lot of research. You go to 16th and 17th century where it was chiefly religious. Music and dance, during the period that I'm talking, they are almost all of it is very, very secular. It was a secular form of entertainment. You see, I see a very nationalistic trend also, where sometimes you would have popular music accompanied by dance to commemorate the birthdays of the various Portuguese monarchs to the throne. Sometimes it was a wedding anniversary, and the Viceroy of Goa or the Governor General, he would give permission. Now, come on, today is the day of the anniversary. Everyone has to assemble at the Teatro União, and you have to enjoy yourself. So it's like affirmation of, that everything was well in Goa, and it's commemorating the monarchs in Portugal. Many of these musical traditions of Europe are reflected here. Just the same reason why the theatre, you have these foreign influences like Madame Blanche and Monsieur Huss, Ariège. They were, solo performances of the operas, ballet, and one of the interesting international violinists, Mr. Agostino Robbio, who was present over here during this time. So you have performances of that stature also were invited here. And lastly, before I end here, is I was trying to find out the history of the fado, which, wanted to know when exactly they were staged. And most of us would know that it was really fado is a latecomer in the scene, the societal scene in Portugal, as well as, of course, the colonies. Now, in Goa, in all the works that have been referenced, there was no reference to the fado except in the 1880s. So it appears to me, I mean, that's my assumption, and I'm not going to say that that is the fact, but that's my hypothesis, because still you find more sources. It's very difficult to claim counter. So in the 1880s onwards, you have a reference to the fado, and most of them were staged at Campal. Campo do Manuel, which is today Campal. So you have these military accompaniments, music that would largely start from, say, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. And one of the musical genres was the fado, which was played by the military band. People would gather, and they would have a nice kind of an entertainment. Now, apart from, these are the violins, the flute, piano, besides that, there's so much to be spoken of, but I'm sure I do not have that permission to talk over here. Now, apart from there, what I've also learned is that even in British India, where Goans had migrated to different places, it's not only the main provinces, but even something called as the Mofosol regions, which were the outskirts of British India, where the Goans had established themselves for jobs. They had very, very entertaining culture. They would assemble, have musical siestas. Women among the Catholic young girls would come and sing, and the violin, the women folk would come, they would have dances. And as I think Professor Jackson also mentioned yesterday, I have come across various type waltzes and polkas and valsavianas. They were, a kind of a waltz which was more slower in number. So different kinds of, kind of arts rather performed throughout Goa and British India where the Portuguese were based. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharmila. Now, without any delay, we will continue. I'd like to invite Dr. Ramana for her presentation on depiction of Portuguese rule in Konkani novels.
Respected Chair, teaching faculty, non-teaching faculty, students, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. The topic on which I'm going to present the paper is depiction of Portuguese rule in Goa in Konkani novels. Now, there is some important chronology that I would like to narrate before you so that the novels are going to go hand in hand with that chronology. Now, 1510 is the year Afonso Albuquerque conquered island of Goa twice. 1541, Inquisition is set up in Portugal. 1560, we have Inquisition which is set up in Goa. 1774, Marques de Pombal, the liberal minister, rendered the Inquisition defunct. 1778, that is just after 4 years, Pombal is removed and Inquisition was revived in a milder form. 1812, Inquisition is officially abolished, and 1961, Goa is liberated from Portuguese rule by Indian Army. I have not mentioned here, but I didn't say it over here. I'd like to mention in 1684, there was a decree or a rule that came to stop the usage of Konkani in totality. 3 years were given for the Goan population to learn Portuguese and not speak Konkani, write in Konkani at all. So this is something I missed over here. Now, as we all know, our literature is reflection of our society, the times that we live in. Speaking about this reflection, how it is in Konkani, just before that, I just want to give you a glimpse of the language, the history of Konkani language. It had its own struggle. First, for quite many centuries, it was referred as dialect of Marathi, not an independent language, on one hand. On the other hand, it was referred as Kiryadanchi Bhas, or language of the help, by others. A lot of efforts from SHENOI GOEMBAB, Eduardo Zebrundasos, CUNHA Rivara, many more, Konkani was accepted at last as a language by Sahitya Academy in 1975. So that's a long years. Okay, so literature reflects society, and this topic is how was the Portuguese rule or the regime reflected in the Konkani literature. Now, in the Konkani literature, if we see all the genre, then poetry usually takes the major chunk, and it talks, usually the poems are related to liberation. Okay, now some of the poets are Bakibab Borkar, who wrote the poems like Nave Yug, then Manorai Sardesai with 18 June, 18 June, Pavitra Manglar, Zayat Zage, that is Wake Up the Goans. Then there are poems like Salat Parte, Go Back, Ikrazan, We 11 People, Kalki Raat Sopli Yaz, The Dark Night is Over. So these are the different poems that we find. There are stories also I had listed down, but due to time, I'm going to just mention a few and move on. There are stories in which you can find the mention of Portuguese regime, the Portuguese soldiers, how they are coming, everything, but it is in the background. It is nowhere coming in the forefront. That is not the main theme of those stories. So such stories were written by Mahabeshwar Sail. Then there are novelettes by Damodar Mauzo, Ravindra Kayekar. Now, for this particular paper, I have taken only novels, and out of which I have chosen only 3. Now, they are written in Konkani and only in Devanagari script. Those written in another script or those written in another language and translated into Konkani are not considered for this paper. So I've taken only 3. First one, which was published in 1978, is called as Paklo by Sri Tukaram Sheth. Yugasavar, that is written by Sri Mahabeshwar Sel, published in 2004. And Wadlager, written by Advocate Uday Bhemre, published in 2021, just 3 years back. Now, so Paklo is actually published first in 1978. But that is talking about the time frame in Paklo is somewhere around near to liberation. So I'm going to discuss that at the very end. First one that I'm going to take is the one written by Mahabeshwar Sel, which is Yugasavar. Yugasavar is written by Mahabeshwar Sel, is translated in English as, the name is Age of Frenzy. It's translated by Vidya Pai. It's published by Harper Perennial, if I'm pronouncing it properly, in 2017. Now, Age of Frenzy is a very abbreviated version from the Yugasavar. Reason was the publisher could not exceed a particular number of pages. I had literally asked about this. Now, what was the main theme of the novel? The main theme of Yugasavar is conversion and inquisition. This novel showcases the fear in the minds of the natives about the Portuguese, be it a Portuguese soldier, a Goan who had joined the Portuguese army, their officers, and their Catholic priest. The author also manages to reflect the thoughts and the aversion of the natives regarding losing their own religion. Now, main themes that I've got in this are conversion and the region and the reasons and the circumstances. So there are numerous reasons and various circumstances in which the conversion from Hindu religion to Catholic religion takes place, Roman Catholic takes place. Eating food offered by Portuguese, as simple as that. And one example is Ganba from Diwali. He on the road he helps someone. That person in returns gives him a roti, a bread, and some fruits soaked in syrup. He eats that. That's it. He is thrown out from his house, village, society. So I'll read just 2 lines from the Konkani novel. गांव इतलेच जाणा आशिल्लो फाटीं 7 समुंदर बलाटून कोण तरी परधर्माचे लोक गोंय गांवांत येयल्यात. त्यांच्या हाताचे खायल्यार सासणाची बाट लागता. I've done a free translation. For villagers, the ultimate truth was that some people from other religion had crossed 7 seas and had come over to village of Goa. Anyone who ate anything offered by them would lose their religion forever. Now, there are many such examples given in Yugasavar. Now, there is one conversation between Saptu SHENOI and Kapitan Figueiredo, which I found really interesting. I'm not going to read the Konkani one, I'll read the translation. Saptu SHENOI says to Kapitan Figueiredo, "You have killed the Moors and married their women to your soldiers by force. You have built the temples of your religion as soon as you have arrived. It seems you are feeding nonsense to Hindus and converting them." To which Figueiredo talks to him and he says, "Do you want to know the truth?" This translation I've done. This is not from the Age of Frenzy. Do you want to know the truth? We even haven't started the process of conversion yet. It's your own doing. You outcast any person from your home, religion, your society who has mistakenly eaten any food served by us. As simple as that. Today, now, in today's Goan society, we eat pav, but earlier, even if you have touched the pav, to batlo, you lost your religion. And we eat pav every day in the morning with our Goan bhaji. Now, conversion by change of heart, we find here Padre Simão Pires, who is a priest who believes in converting people by being benevolent, by following the benevolent method of preaching love and kindness. And he is against forcible conversion. He goes, he talks, he gives sermons. And there are people who listen to him and there is change of heart and they willingly go and convert to the new religion. Now, there are conversions by simple coincidence. A Portuguese has used a chulla on the... Chulla is stone. Oh, a stove, fire. Okay, you have got the point. The chulla on the road where you cook the food. Okay. A Hindu family came and cooked on it. Cooked the whatever food they wanted on that. Over, batlo. As simple as that, and they were considered as batlo. Now, there is conversion to avoid punishment. There is incident, example where Thomas, he says, I was earlier demo, I ended up robbing something, I got caught, and to avoid punishment, I was given the choice. Either you choose the punishment or you convert. He chose the latter. There is conversion to avoid sati. Now, usually when we talk about the certain customs which were there earlier, which were inhumane, we have a tendency to say everybody at all times in history did this. Yugasavar, this author, he mentions that sati, that is a widow burning herself on the dead body of her husband, this particular practice is called sati. It was practiced only by the Solanki, that is the Kshatriya, the fighter class or the caste of the Hindus in Goa. And he says, and he gives an example where a father takes his daughter, who's just 13-year-old, takes her to the priest Simao Peris and tells him, take Gunai, take my daughter away, so I don't want her to burn. And Padre Simao takes the risk and takes the daughter, and he, of course, he converts her. He takes her to a safe place, and this was one of the reasons. So there are many reasons which are put by Yugasavar. Conversion to avoid ill treatment as a low caste, Dugamar, many converted, and this happens in the starting, in the first 1500 pages of this novel. At the end, we find there are questions raised by Dugamar saying, I was told that the new religion does not have the caste system. Where is it? I was a Hindu Mar, now I am a Catholic Mar. The caste is not changing. Sadly, in Goa only, so this is one example. Conversion in order to gain land or to save land. Now, villages after villages were getting converted, and the people realized that either way I'm going to get converted, and they were giving land to the new Catholics. So why not? It will help me. So that was one. Some said, okay, I need to maintain the land. There are so many people that I need to feed and everything. So okay, fine, I will convert. And they have converted for those reasons. This is one aspect. Did it change remain only up to the religion part? No, it also changed the Gaonkari. The Gaonkari or the Comunidad that you had earlier. The Gaonkari was maintaining the functioning of the village, but and there is an example where this particular village, it throws out the people who have converted to the new religion. So that's when Captain comes and tells him, no, the new converted Catholics will be the head. Their name will be written first. You are not going to be in the you will lose the right to Gaonkari. So these are the changes. Losing the property, many more. I'll move on to the next one. Next novel. Just have 3 minutes left if it's 15 minutes given to me. Vadleghar is by Advocate Uday Bhemre, and he has focused not on the conversion, only on the Inquisition. Okay? And he talks about the protagonist Kaitan Vaz, how he is falsely accused. He is taken to Santa Casa, that is the holy house, also known as Vadleghar, where Inquisition was set up. The entire detail, the working, their daily routine, the torture, the punishment, everything that is documented in Vadleghar is not a figment of author's imagination. It is not. It is, he has used Dr. Charles Dellon's autobiographical work, who was a French doctor in Daman, and now I'm going to literally massacre the name of the title of the book, Relation de l'Inquisition de Goa. Pardon me. It was published in 1688 in French and translated in English. He has used this. This is one point, that this particular book gives you in detail the entire working of the Inquisition. Second point, I want to mention from Vadleghar, Piedad, Kaitan's wife. She is an example of those people who got converted but were not able to be fully convinced of the new religion. Kaitan, on one hand, is totally devoted of, he's a very pious Catholic. He has converted, he has accepted, and he is doing whatever has been told to him. Piedad is not able to, she's not a rebel, but she's not able to find herself or tune herself to that. So by day, she's a Catholic. By night, she goes in her room, changes into a Hindu attire, removes the gauze from the basket or something which is kept, does the puja, puts it back, changes, removes all her kumkum and the Mangalsutra, everything, dresses back as a Catholic. So this is the dual. She's a very good example of how the duality worked. And third is they talk about is the migration that took place where the families were torn apart. Third novel, Pakla, is by Tukaram Sheth. Pakla is a protagonist. He is born as Vithu. His mother is a Goan, a Hindu, and an Indian by nationality. She is raped by Pakla officer Chef Carmo, a Catholic, a Portuguese by nationality. She gets pregnant. She gives birth to this child. The child by race is white. The society does not accept him. This boy has not seen his father. He doesn't know how to be a Portuguese or anything. He doesn't know English, nothing. He's not accepted by this particular community just because his race is white. That's it. And there are many examples over there. I'm not going to go through it. This is the only novel, Pakla, which talks about where you can see the reflection of Goan freedom struggle. The first two, they are not because they're totally in the era which is 1560, 1580. And this is the only one which is nearing the liberation. In conclusion, there are very few authors in Konkani who have attempted to write about Portuguese rule and its effects in detail in the novel genre. The liberation moment and its people's sentiments are well captured in poetry. Second, the authors are also part of the Goan society. As a result, they have made a conscious effort to be sensitive about the issue and have shouldered the responsibilities very well as authors. They're not emotional, they're dealing with the subject, they're not getting carried away, and also they are trying to be historically as accurate as possible. They have also a balanced view. They have put forward the reasons of the conversion from both the sides. It's not just one that the Portuguese were converting. Today we are eating pau, then why? What happened at that time? Simple touching someone entering your house, you are losing your religion and caste so easily. These are the questions which are raised. So we see people like Pakla's story throws light on those innocent lives who were neither accepted. They were not accepted by both the societies. And as a researcher, I feel that certain themes about the Portuguese rule can be explored in Konkani. Some topics are like, what was the life of the people after the removal of the Inquisition Tribunal? What was the rule under Salazar? Operation Vijay is another unexplored topic. Rani's revolt, Pinto's revolt. And what about the story of the migrants, those who migrated to other states like Karnataka, especially in Udupi, Kumtha, these are the areas. So these are some of the thoughts, and this is the conclusion on this particular topic. Thank you all for listening so patiently. If there are any suggestions you can give me to improve the paper, please do so. And I thank the organizers and the chair for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Backlander, for this fascinating view of our culture from inside. Now I suspect we'll have a very interesting contrast from Inés Torres de la Cerda on the perspectives on Goa and India from the other side in contemporary Portuguese literature. So I'm happy to welcome Inés La Cerda to the book.
Thank you. Whoop. Does the trackpad work? I don't see it. There we go. Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And yes, I fully agree. I think it's going to be a really interesting contrast. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues for their work, David Jackson for moderating the panel, but most of all for the organizers of the conference and for the invitation to be here. Thank you for all your hard work. Let me start by contextualizing what I do. I'm a literary scholar who deals with literatures embedded in histories of imposed silence. And the word silence is actually working overtime here because it not only reflects the relatively marginalized positions granted to the corpus of my work within a Portuguese canon, but also relates to my presentation. You see, yesterday, Rosa Maria talked to us about visual images, and Nalini talked to us about sound. So it's only appropriate that today I also talk about the senses, specifically sound and smell. The work I'm discussing with you today is situated within a larger project where I'm thinking about the Portuguese Empire in the Indian Pacific. Specifically, how spaces such as Goa have been imagined and inscribed into contemporary Portuguese literature. How it's been affected by decolonial processes and political movements, such as the liberation of Goa. These spaces rest on a complicated dynamic centered on a mutual and reciprocal influence, where Asian contexts act on figures with some Portuguese affiliation, where they can't always be controlled or subjugated by colonial domination and its associated patriarchy. When I first embarked on this project, I wanted to think about autobiographies, looking at how the senses materialize within the scope of memory, cultural performance, and political resistance, and how these help us construct the Portuguese Empire overseas. The project has since evolved. I'm still working on this separately, thinking about Portuguese-born women writing autobiographies about the empire while living in 20th century Portuguese Asia. So I was thrilled about Sheila's presentation just before lunch, because today I want to talk to you about one example, which is Adila Gaitonde's As Maçãs Azuis. Adila Gaitonde, I think now doesn't require an introduction. We understand that she was the first Portuguese woman to marry a Hindu man from India, and that they had a difficult relationship in the sense of her integration into Indian society, right? And her husband, Dr. Pundalik Gaitonde, was not only a very important figure in his community, but a critical figure in the Goan liberation movement. Why am I thinking about the biography or the autobiography? As Sanjay Subramanian has noted, quote, the resort to biography could be posed as a way of reasserting the centrality of historical agency. That is, the autobiography satisfies a demand for truth in a historical narrative because, subjective as it may be, the author doesn't absolve themselves of responsibility for the text. So let's start with one of the first examples from As Maçãs Azuis, which is Edila's wedding day. So she describes the occasion in sensorial terms and likens the event to the experience of tasting something unique. I'm going to cite the book in Portuguese, but I do have the English translation up here. Aquele sábado teve sabor especial para mim. Era lindo dia de sol de temperatura amena e o meu coração pulsava de alegria. Para qualquer rapariga, o dia do casamento é o mais importante da sua vida. Taste, or the illusion of taste, is created by combining sensation, thought, and emotion. Gaitonde recalls the taste of her wedding day, not just from the food, but from the atmosphere and the emotions she felt. This day, the most important in her life, merges written description with lived reality, capturing its special qualities through taste. She blends physical sensation and imagination to create a contemplative experience where taste combines sensory feelings with emotion. Taste reveals the author's focus on the connection between the senses and emotion, but touch and sight also play significant roles. Gaitonde mentions the visual and the haptic repeatedly as she and her husband travel for the first time from Lisbon to Mumbai, the first of many, many journeys they would end up taking together. And despite facing disappointments like racialized comments and travel delays, they hold on to the hope of a vibrant city as their new home. However, their dreams are shattered upon their arrival in India. Pobre Lica tinha esperado 10 longos anos para voltar ao seu país e as luzes de Bombaim tinham sido a última visão que guardara na memória. Mas não estavam lá. As luzes não se viam. It's monsoon season, and the weather obscures the city's bright lights. So in this moment, what the young couple sees, or rather what they don't, has two important meanings. First, sight connects past memories with current emotions, shaping the couple's expectations of Mumbai. But the absence of city lights challenges their assumption of a warm welcome in India, especially because Laika, an Indian doctor passionate about fighting in Goa's liberation movement, never really anticipated having a white Catholic Portuguese wife, right? And Sheila went into this in great detail. And I apologize because I just realized my citations are not in English. Please forgive me. Come ask me later for a translation and I'll do it on the fly. The monsoon's visual impact continuously leads to Adila Gaitonde's physical and emotional discomfort upon arriving in India. O calor era sufocante e sentia as gotas de suor a escorrer-me pelo corpo abaixo. She writes, confessing that, só me dava vontade de chorar com a dor do meu desapontamento e desconforto da situação em que me encontrava. This incident blends outer and inner sensations, creating a synesthetic understanding of the cultural clash faced by the couple. The humid stickiness of sweat and the sun's heat combine to evoke her suffocating pain, both physical and emotional. This discomfort extends beyond the weather as she feels rejected by her husband's family and struggles with the language barrier. At first, right? Because we learned that she did learn Konkani. Unlike her pleasant wedding day, she now finds herself in a thick, suffocating atmosphere, unable to communicate effectively. These intense physical and emotional experiences highlight her cultural discomfort in these new surroundings. Gaitonde's use of visuals and implied sounds vividly captures the bustling energy of Mumbai, drawing readers into the scene with empathetic imagination. The city's movements come alive on the page, and as she struggles to understand the cacophony of languages, readers are similarly challenged by the text's silence, mirroring linguistic barriers. She writes, acabava de chegar a mundo totalmente diferente, impregnado de cheiros intensos e vozes múltiplas, em línguas múltiplas. So I'll translate this one really quick. I just arrived in a completely different world, pregnant with intense smells and multiple voices in multiple languages. Dealing with the in-between, to borrow Silviano Santiago's terminology, means recognizing that the author stands out for her race and her religion. She remembers feeling exposed and uncomfortable when children stared at her in the street, wearing a sari, and her rejection reflects the hierarchies like the caste system, which dictates social norms and interactions. And this becomes clear after Adila's unsettling encounter with these children, where smell becomes a way to distinguish different backgrounds and understand the connection between scent and identity. Feeling lonely and confused on an unfamiliar street, she's surprised when strangers offer her a cup that was steaming and smelling of cardamom. So it's cardamom tea. And as she drinks this tea, its aroma makes her aware of the caste boundaries and her own sense of difference to the people surrounding her. That night, she feels compelled to wash away the day's grime, hoping to cleanse herself of her inner sadness. And through these experiences, the scent of cardamom prompts her awareness of impurity, a sensation felt only by her senses as it permeates her body and surroundings. But pause, because I want to very quickly bring in Garcia de Horta's colloquies, which was brought up earlier today. And I think this passage is especially interesting. So in a conversation with the imaginary Dr. Juano, his Spanish friend, Garcia de Horta stops halfway and asks his servant boy to bring him some black cardamom to demonstrate how, quote, these black ones are much used because their scent is better for the mouth and for chewing and clearing the head. And in As Maçãs Azuis, the cardamom's odor overwhelms and is detectable only through the author's senses, as the smell of the tea imposes a gradual awareness of the impurity or the feeling of impurity that pervades and dissipates throughout her purportedly uncleansed body. But it also signals a turning point in her relationship to India, because she realizes her impurity is not only because of her status as a European, but also her inability to let go of that identity and embrace her new life in Goa. And so we see how she changes that perspective later in life. Gaitonde's first time joining a religious procession marks a shift in how she perceives her place in Indian society. As the first event in which she's allowed to participate formally as a member of the family, this moment holds special significance in her memoir, and the anticipation of this communal event signifies a turning point. A praia de Palolém é uma das mais lindas de Goa, e naquela noite parecia que a natureza queria partilhar conosco esta ocasião tão festiva e sagrada. O orvalho da noite tinha já coberto toda a vegetação, que agora emanava doce aroma. So there's a sweet aroma around the beach at this moment. Sacred fragrances mingle with other bodily faculties here to create sensations of visuality and musical orality, amplifying the affective correspondences of the moment. Actual scents mix with imaginary ones as the sweet aroma of the night dew give way to the author's feelings of communal identity. And she crucially invites the olfactory senses to share in the beauty of the beach with us. Notions of community are on the coast, which comprise an essential aspect of the ceremony she witnesses. She writes, os tambores eram persecutidos com mais e mais som, já ensurdecedor, juntava-se agora ao som do mar. So the sound of the drums joins the sound of the sea. But prior to receiving this family blessing, Gaitonde considered the procession of these drums differently, saying that they, quote, faziam barulho horrendo e todo o cortejo me parecia pouco grosseiro e pouco reverente. So she's calling this parade too much. It's kind of gross to her. But even if the rhythms and the melodies of the drums are the same, her perceptions of them have changed according to her expanded sensorial view of the new life she now has standing before her. And it's ultimately through this sensorial lens that she affirms her positionality within the historical archive, stating, como europeia católica, casada com hindu, tornava-me a ponte natural que unia estas duas sociedades. As a Catholic European married to a Hindu, I became the natural bridge uniting these two societies. The senses are crucial to unpacking how status frames social realities, as odors carry and sustain spatial and bodily politics. In another example, the very suggestion of Gaitonde's transgressive European musk provides a way of discerning how smell moves through a contextual system of social differentiation. We also need to acknowledge that the intensity of sensation the author brings to the fore relates not merely to ideas of racialized status, but also polluting notions of colonial empire. As Shivani Kapoor notes, the ethereality of smell has similarly served to accentuate justifications of colonial rule. And I'll quote her here, the British in India, while thinking of themselves as odorless, or at least as having an acceptable odor, were smelling, tasting, and feeling the colony with great intensity. And she says that for this reason, quote, the entire human sensorium was engaged in acts of making and accommodating and resisting empire. Through this historical processing, the olfactory takes up an even more fraught position, wherein its social meaning fluctuates according to whom scent attaches. And if we want, which I do, we can even gesture towards the 16th century Codex Casanatense, which invariably shows people from India engaging in scented activities like trade, but most importantly, in mediating scent, right? So here we have a group of women, for example, communally bathing. As Maçãs Azuis presents a twofold argument. First, Gaitonde shows that autobiographies engage all the senses, not just sight, sparking readers' imaginations as well as authorial memory. But second, she emphasizes that her book isn't just about her life, but also about a shared historical moment. She presents Goa's liberation as a complex blend of thoughts, memories, and sensory experiences. And I only wish I had more time to talk about that aspect, but I think Sheila's presentation also went into that a little bit. But also she navigates her new world by connecting sensory experiences with broader themes of identity and history. And this, I argue, allows us to glimpse at the penumbra of empire. That is, those elements where some light or attention is cost, though not all, leaving us to contemplate the parts where no light reaches. Muito obrigada. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Inés. I'm sure that you've all noticed that the reflections of Portuguese in these works of literature are all necessarily critical ones. And now we're going to hear Rochelle Fernandez speak on a chink in the facade, slavery and social decay in Joseph Furtado's Golden Goa.
A very good afternoon. Before I actually start, I want to say that a couple of things changed for me when I was writing this paper. And actually, I gave Dhruv this title just to give him something less to worry about, because I knew he really needed to get that schedule out, and I was holding him back. So as I was writing this paper and rereading the text, I kind of changed it up a little bit. So I apologize for that, but this is actually a little better. So the new title of this paper is Reconstructing the Lived Histories of Slavery in Colonial Goa Through Fiction, a reading of Joseph Furtado's Golden Goa. Before I get into the nitty-gritties of this paper, I want to just give you a bit of context, all right? So Ernestine Carrera writes that the 16th century saw the introduction of slavery in Goa, which was modeled after two communities, the Atlantic Islands and the Islamic cultures of Asia. In these societies, serfdom, slavery, and vassalage coexisted in varying degrees of subservience, closely linking these forms of servitude. Carmo de Souza maintains that slavery was legally recognized and the interests of slave lords were protected, and runaways, if found, had to be reported. Furthermore, de Souza states that there was no distinction between slaves and other animate and inanimate contractual objects such as beasts or ships. J. Talboys Wheeler wrote that the Portuguese established depots for the purchase of slaves in India, and in Goa, female slaves were present in every Portuguese household and aided their masters by earning money through the sale of sweetmeats and confectionaries. Dr. Fatima de Silva Gracias maintains that the women in the families often encouraged their sons to engage in affairs with the household female slaves instead of visiting prostitutes for fear of venereal diseases. Husbands were also encouraged to cohabit with slave girls who obviously had no say, but then had to endure the wrath of the wives. Timothy Walker maintains that a variety of ethnic groups made up the slave population in Portuguese India. The majority came from Mozambique, which was Portuguese controlled, though some slaves in Goa may be traced back to other African nations. Some slaves had mixed ancestries, some of whom were Afro-European, Afro-Indian, or Afro-Indian European. While there is no record of manumitted slaves, Timothy Walker adds that the number of manumissions increased considerably in the 1830s, which could have merely been a facade. Given the tendency, and I quote, given the tendency of slave owners in Portuguese colonial territories to mask the status of their forced laborers, these figures may represent an increase in slave owners reporting a purely nominal change in the status of their former slaves to that of free laborers. In reality, they maintained their workers in a state of bondage. An absence of manumission certificates in the historical documentation of Estado de India for this period is a telling indicator, close quotes. In addition, Carmo de Souza states that a slave could free themselves by paying compensation to their master from money earned by begging or labor. Insisting on compensation clearly indicates that the property rights of the master over the slave was seen as more important than the freedom and dignity of the slave as human being. Slavery was later abolished in 1896 in all Portuguese dominions. Now, to piece together this coherent picture of slavery in Goa, I relied on the scholarship of Ernestine Carrera, Timothy Walker, Jeanette Pinto, Kirill Kamar Prasad, J. Talboys Wheeler, and Dr. Fatima de Silva Gracias, amongst so many other scholars. Yet, remarkably, every thread of this narrative that I have just read out to you finds reference in Joseph Furtado's novella, Golden Goa. Now, does this mean we should forsake academic research in favor of literary fiction? Absolutely not. What it does mean, however, is that we should reconsider the boundaries we place on literature and recognize fiction as more than mere imagination. It is often a creative rendering of reality. Fiction has the power to illuminate truths, preserve voices, and fill the silences left by traditional archives, making it an invaluable tool for understanding history. Fictional media, such as novels and films, hold the power to shape and sustain cultural memory by creating resonant images of the past. As Astrid Earle, a notable proponent of memory studies, argues, while these works may lack historical accuracy, they achieve truthfulness or authenticity, influencing collective perceptions and becoming enduring memorials. Unlike lived narratives that anchor events to the contemporary, fiction often transforms them into timeless phenomena. Earle also emphasizes the transmedial nature of memory, when narratives can shift across media, from literature to film or song, offering flexible and multidimensional representations of the past. This highlights literature's capacity to document history creatively and inclusively, capturing nuances often excluded from traditional archives. Additionally, Hayden White distinguishes between what he calls the historical past, which relies on authenticated evidence, and the practical past, which draws on memory, emotion, and experience to navigate everyday life and decisions. The practical past, though often overlooked by conventional historiography, is open to literary exploration, addressing aspects like love and suffering that resist direct historical documentation. Literature thus engages with the real past to illuminate emotional and experiential truths, filling the gaps left by historical records. With this, I now come to my novella. Slavery under Portuguese rule shaped Goan society for centuries, leaving a legacy that persists in its social and cultural memory. Yet traditional historical records, often damaged, fail to convey the lived realities of enslaved individuals or the broader societal impact of slavery. Fiction, as this paper argues, offers a unique and essential lens for filling these gaps. Joseph Furtado's Golden Goa, in particular, originally published in 1938, emerges as a significant resource for reconstructing the social history of slavery in Goa, blending a factual account with creative storytelling to illuminate the complexities of this period. I realize that I missed a slide, and you're probably wondering what this has to do with anything that I just said, but it'll make sense now. Slavery in Portuguese Goa was integral to its economy and society, and enslaved individuals performed various roles, from agriculture and commercial labor to domestic services. And despite its prevalence, archival evidence of slavery in Goa appears fragmented. Records such as the 1855 slave registry, as you see on your screen, categorize slaves as servants, possibly for two reasons. One, to avoid officially registering them as slaves, as the registry was designed to record enslaved individuals in preparation for eventual emancipation, as proposed by Timothy Walker. And two, simply because many enslaved individuals performed roles akin to those of servants, despite the fundamental difference that they were legally enslaved and that their labor was most often unpaid. This complexity highlights the need for alternative coherent sources to reconstruct the lived experiences and societal structures shaped by slavery. Furtado's Golden Goa serves as one such alternative. It draws from a unique historical source, a manuscript diary of a Spanish Dominican chaplain who served the Portuguese viceroys between 1538 and 1548. Now, diaries as incidental evidence offers valuable snapshots of daily life, providing insights into social structures, individual experiences, and broader social dynamics. And this paper explores how Furtado uses the diary to craft a narrative that not only critiques colonial society, but also brings to life a golden Goa that contrasts sharply with idealized portrayals of the past. The preface of Golden Goa, The preface of Golden Goa reveals that the narrative is rooted in the diary of a Spanish Dominican chaplain, as I just said, who recorded political, ecclesiastical, and social events in the Portuguese Indies. The diary's survival is testament to its historical significance. It was preserved during the suppression of religious orders in 1835, when Padre Mariano de San Jose, an inmate of the convent of St. Francis de Assisi, took it into safekeeping. Later, it came into the possession of Dr. Mariano José Correa Lobo, Padre Mariano's nephew, who shared its contents with Furtado when he was serving as a medical officer in the author's village. This manuscript forms a backbone of Golden Goa, allowing Furtado to construct a narrative that is as much historical reconstruction as it is fiction. Antoinette Burton's Dwelling in the Archive offers critical framework for rethinking the boundaries of history and memory, public and private, and the nature of the archive itself. Burton disrupts the traditional opposition between public history and private memory by centering the writings of three 20th century Indian women, Janki Majumdar, Cornelia Sorabji, and Atiya Hussain, as counter-narratives to colonial modernity. And these memoirs and fictional accounts challenge masculinist grand narratives and foreground the domestic, emotional, and subjective dimensions of history. Burton's analysis highlights that these personal and intimate writings are not peripheral, but central to understanding the complexities of colonial and post-colonial histories. Following Burton's precedent, it becomes evident that sources like diaries hold immense historical significance. Diaries, much like the writings Burton examines, serve as repositories of lived experience, offering granular details and emotional insights that formal archives often overlook. and they blur the line between history and memory, revealing the nuances of social structures, personal relationships, and cultural practices. For example, concerning Joseph Hurtado's Golden Goa, the diary of the Spanish Dominican chaplain not only provides political and ecclesiastical records, but also brings to light the everyday realities of slavery and colonial life in Goa. Like the memoirs Burton analyzes, the diary functions as an alternative archive of lived realities of individuals, which enriches our understanding of marginalized histories, challenging the limitations of traditional records that often document and prioritize political or economic narratives. In this way, such alternative archives bridge the gap between personal reflection and public history, embodying what theorist Pierre Nora terms as sites of memory, places or objects through which societies remember and reconstruct their past. The column that Mr. Alindo Coelho showed us yesterday of slaves burdened by the weight that they were carrying, or the photographs that Professor Rosa Maria Perez shared with us yesterday, exemplifies this very function, preserving snapshots of Goa's colonial history and offering incidental evidence about social, cultural, and political life in the Portuguese Indies. This seemingly unique piece of art then becomes a tool for reconstructing the complex realities of a bygone era. Joseph Hurtado was born in Pilen, Goa, and he is supposedly one of the earliest yet least known Indian English poets. These are a couple of photographs of his of the dilapidated structure of his home in Pilen. Okay, this was actually clicked by a professor of mine from St. Xavier's because he lives in Pilen, so it just seemed easier to ask him than have to go through the Porvory traffic. Right. Hurtado himself remains a figure of quiet obscurity, with only a few images recognizable by his flowing beard available online. Now, when Golden Goa was handed over to me to edit by the kind folks at Cinnamon Teal Design and Publishing, I initially read it as a romance, and it was terrible because, as someone who studies literature, I should have known better. But after rereading it, and after yet a closer reading of this novel, it kind of reveals something very crucial, and that was the pervasive presence of African slaves in Goa. Although, and not just African slaves, all kinds of slaves, but more African than others. And although relegated to the background, these characters appear throughout the text, exposing the harsh realities of slavery under Portuguese rule. The novel portrays a society rife with moral decay, making the title Golden Goa deeply ironic. There's very little golden about this aspect of Goa's history. And this is very significant because, as Hurtado maintains, the slave market certainly presented the most interesting and pathetic sights in the cities. The slaves in Goa were not solely of African descent. There were also white slaves who were in high demand and in some cases became agents of significant social and personal upheaval. Public slave auctions provide insight into this diversity, revealing how both black and Syrian female slaves were sold, with one Syrian slave described as infernally pretty. While female slaves shared the same living quarters, clear hierarchies existed based on skin color. Fairer-skinned slaves were often preferred and accorded privileges such as diamond necklaces, luxurious rugs, and in some cases, grand baptisms that elevated their status within their enslaved condition. An instance from the text is the account of Inês. She's a white slave, and her master adored her to such an extent that their son was baptized and she was referred to as Dona Inês. Although her elevated status granted her certain privileges and freedoms, she remained bound to her master for the duration of his life. Hurtado notes, a slave, if lucky, becomes a dona, capturing the precarious and conditional nature of such upward mobility, whereas black slaves like Deliciosa did not appear to receive any special treatment. Interestingly, an entire chapter is dedicated to the intertwined lives of Inês's son and Deliciosa's son who grew up together. The narrative explores their mischievous behavior in society, juxtaposed with moments that reveal their potential for kindness, loyalty, and understanding. In essence, it humanizes them. In a traditional archive, these slave children might have been recorded by their lineage or in terms of ownership. Another author who often looks at this aspect is Chinua Achebe. If you look at Things Fall Apart, the protagonist Okonkwo has an extraordinary life story, full of struggles, full of triumphs. But after his death by suicide, the European District Commissioner reduces his entire life to a single paragraph. In contrast, Achebe has dedicated an entire novella to telling the story of someone as remarkable as Okonkwo. And what I'm trying to say is that through fiction, this highlights the profound difference in how lives are remembered depending on who is telling the story. Furtado recounts another instance where African slaves, referred to as Kafris, were tasked with carrying water from the Bangini fountain to the city for sale. Now, although the distance was relatively short and transporting water through pipes to the capital would have been more efficient and economical, the option was deliberately avoided. It was deemed politically unwise to deprive the Kafris of this essential means of livelihood, highlighting the complex interaction between economic pragmatism and the social structures that sustained the system of slavery. Through these nuanced narratives, Golden Goa offers a compelling window into the complexities of slavery in colonial Goa, in illustrating how intersecting factors such as race, gender, and personal relationships shaped the lived realities of enslaved individuals. I'm going to conclude now because I think okay. While Golden Goa is a work of fiction, its foundation in historical fact makes it a critical resource for understanding colonial society. The novel's nuanced portrayal of slavery, the complexities of colonial governance, and the intersections of religion, power, and resistance highlights its value as a supplementary historical source. By blending the observations of the Spanish Dominican, who somewhat serves as an accidental or maybe an intentional amateur anthropologist, interspersed with his own critical analysis, Furtado creates a narrative that brings to life the society of colonial Goa. Furtado's narrative is particularly important given that slavery in Goa was reportedly abolished in 1876. His lifetime spanned the transitional post-abolition period, perhaps allowing him to capture the social memory of slavery and its lingering effects. Through Golden Goa, Furtado provides insights into how slavery shaped Goan society and how its legacy was remembered or forgotten in the decades that followed. This is a history that archives alone cannot tell, but fiction, with its ability to convey emotional truths and subjective experiences, can illuminate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. Now we've seen examples of critical portraits in theater, in fiction, in personal memoir, and the social memoir. And I think we can take 5 minutes for us for questions. Yes, Gugu Cardozo, please, can we get a microphone to Dr. Cunha?
Hi, well, congratulations to all 4 presenters. These were really fascinating talks. I wanted to pick up on Rochelle Fernandez's suggestion that, fiction can fill in the gaps that conventional historiographical sources do not. I understand your point, but I just wanted to hear your opinion on the following. Does it not make a difference whether or not the person in question, the author of a particular work of fiction, is working about a setting that he has lived in and his own time, versus someone who is working about a different period? I'm thinking, for example, when you look at, even if you only think about the kind of literature that made a contribution to anti-colonial thinking. On the one hand, you have, for example, Multatuli's Max Havelaar, which is about the Dutch East Indies, and was written by someone who was writing about a place that he knew and a time that he lived. And here, I guess, I don't know the book that you talked about, I'm curious to read it now, but it seems to me that the author was writing in the 20th century about a period much before, right? Or am I wrong?
So just correct me if I'm wrong, you're asking me if an author can write about a historical period if he lived during that period?
No, if you interpret his work in the same way, or that we attach more factuality in one case than you do in the other, that we have to do this and make this distinction.
Well, I'm still not very clear on what you are asking me. If there's just...
Right, okay, let me rephrase. So it seemed to me that your suggestion was that because there are so many gaps in historiography, that a work of fiction about a particular period and a phenomenon like the one that you showed will help us understand that phenomenon. I agree with that, but to me it makes a difference whether the person has actually lived that reality or not, right? Wouldn't you agree?
No, I do agree to a certain extent, but as someone who dips her toes in memory studies here and there, I truly believe that we can't just stop talking about something that happened in the past because there is no text that talks about it before us. Okay, like I mean, if you look at what Sheila Jaivan told us earlier, and she talks about her great-grandaunt, if there was no text, and to say this was just memories that were passed on from generation to generation, would we not accept that as the truth? You know, like that's what I'm trying to say. The issue here is that I think it's very I think it's very important to, like, okay, I'll give you an example from my own work that I've been doing. I've been working on this these informally adopted children known as post-care, okay, in colonial Goa, and I've just submitted my thesis. I wasn't born during this time when it happened. I was born in 1995, and from whatever I've read so far, the practice faded post-liberation in 1961. But people have spoken about it. There's literature that talks about it. There's Wendell Rodericks, who wrote a book as recent as 2017. He wasn't born during that period either. Do we say then what Wendell Rodericks has written is inaccurate? What if there are people who can actually corroborate what he is saying? And there are people who do that. So, I mean, even Orlando da Costa's No Flowers, No Wreaths, we are talking about it today. And if you actually look at that text, it has so much of resonance with what exactly happened in the past. Now, we can say that all of that is fiction. Orlando da Costa's No More. Who are we going to ask? What if what he wrote was actually just imagination and didn't exist? But we don't do that, right? Because we believe that authors are influenced by their environment. So similarly, I feel that we can't say that you have to be born in a particular period to be writing about that particular period, and anyone born later does it inaccurately. I don't think we can say that. And I think it is definitely important to corroborate what we're reading in fiction with other academic accounts. I think that is very important. But other than that, I think fiction is a very important source of history.
Yes, Rosa Maria.
Okay, thank you so much for all the presentations. I feel tempted to ask more questions again for Rochelle, since we are dealing with so many topics in common. Memory is one of them, memory and the archives. And I would feel tempted, even now, to reply to Hugo's question, to suggest Cameron and All Societies Remember, and the other book, All Societies Forget, which is a kind of mirror of one another. But I'm not going into that field, which is not mine. It's just a note, and we can carry on afterwards, about the slavery in Goa. And at a certain stage, I had the privilege of working with Michael Pearson. Unfortunately, he passed away, as you know. And there were many books dedicated to his memory. And then I tried to dig in the topic of slavery in the Indian Ocean. And because I have started carrying out a research with the cities of Gujarat, and it seems that when it comes to Goa, there were also not only African slaves brought by the Portuguese, but also, and this is one thing, the cities that were Muslims. And after Portuguese colonialism, they were kind of pushed to North Karnataka, for example. Some of them converted to Catholicism. That is one thing. And the other thing is that after reading so much, even though, of course, I'm not an historian, I think regarding slavery, even though it's not your central topic, that usually we feel tempted to adopt the dominant paradigm, which is the Atlantic one, to the Indian Ocean. And indeed, it's different, but well, memory and our societies remember, and our societies remember already, also through literary studies. Of course, it's something that appeals to me. Thank you so much.
This is to anybody from the panel. I think based on the two questions, the larger question is how much can we rely on oral history?
You know, a lot of people think that oral histories and memories, they're subjective experiences, and so therefore, is there any authenticity in them? How can we authenticate them? I would ask you a counter question, actually. How do you know that everything in the archive is accurate? I mean, I think this is very important, and we must remember this, that the archives were created in a very political fashion. There were things that were left out, and whether we like to accept it or not. In fact, I was having a conversation with my friend Faust outside, and we were speaking about the Inquisition records. Where are they? Why were they burned? Right, so we have to consider that archives also cannot be trusted. And again, I will speak from my own work. When I was working at the Goa State Archive, I found this registry of slaves from 1855. And if you look at it, it's a big book. It's a thick book. You open it and you will not find records written consecutively. There are pages that are left in between. And as I said here, and I repeat, Timothy Walker proposed that this was done intentionally to make the book look full. It makes the book look full, but actually people did not want to record their slaves because they did not want to manumit them. And if they were not recorded as slaves, who were they going to manumit? So archives cannot be trusted entirely. Of course, I'm sure a lot of historians here will believe otherwise. But
I'm from the Department of History, and we rely on the archives quite a lot, as much as oral sources and newspapers and all kinds of literature. Now, what I have to say is that generally the archives, you can't discredit either of the sources. But if you can, one complements the other, that is beneficial. Like say for instance, you have a lot of folk songs on the Ranis fighting with the Portuguese, and there, we know that in history there have been records where there have been a lot of conflicts. There is something called as a perspective, as Rosa Maria Parish also says that it is a government perspective, and the government has its own agenda. You have to sometimes listen to, so there are two perspectives which cannot be discounted. I think that is very important to understand that, because as colonizers, they have their perspective, they have their agendas. The governed, they see it differently. So I think it just helps us to have a very comprehensive idea of the rulers and the ruled, which is very, very important. So I think for me, and I think it's very important to understand this, and both are important. Better, sometimes there are exaggerations. Government will also exaggerate. It happens all the time, so we have to accept things with a pinch of salt. And if we as writers and researchers have to be able to discern what is right and wrong. Thank you.
This is in conversation of Dr. Sharmila Pais. As a Goan genealogist, I do agree that there are three very important aspects. One is the oral history, one is literature, and the other one is the archives. I use all three sources when I need to verify people's births and family trees and the creation of it. Talking about the slavery, I think also it's important to point out that our Goans themselves were also heavily involved in slave trade. I did some research into family from Rivara who were based in Mozambique in 1810, 1815, and it's very clearly indicated that he was the largest slave trader in the region. So, to say that, I think our Goans were also equally involved in it.
Any other questions? So I think if I'm not mistaken, we're going to make a slight change in the program and continue directly with the valedictory part, and the tea service will come after the last section of the program. So if that's correct, please confirm and we'll continue directly with our program.
Yes, thank you, Professor Jackson. I'm sure you enjoyed leading that all-women panel, and they all did a great job. So before we have the valedictory session on, may I request Professor Jackson to hand over a memento to each of the panelists, please? Yes. Starting with Dr. Sharmila Paij. Dr. Rama Murkunde. Raj de la Cerda, I'm sorry. And Rochelle Fernandez. Thank you, everyone. I request Rochelle, member of the steering committee, to kindly escort the panelists back to their seats. Okay, after we take a quick group photograph. I request everyone to be seated among the audience, please. We've had 2 days of deliberations, discussion, debate, discovery, and hopefully you found it to be delectable food too. No doubt it's been a feast of ideas, cultural exchanges, eye-opening revelations, and as more than one of us has mentioned today, a feast of varied and colorful pronunciations of proper nouns, which of course is most welcome at a forum like this one. As we finally come to the valedictory session, may I request Mr. Franz Schubert Cotta to escort the dignitaries to the dais. The valedictory speaker, Dr. Hugo Cardozo, Professor of Linguistics, University of Lisbon. The convener of Sir Kenneth David Jackson, if you would like to come. Yes, yes, yes. All right, okay. The co-conveners, Professor Anuradha Wagle, Dean, SHENOI GOEMBAB School of Languages and Literature, and Professor Koshi Tarakkan, Dean, School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies. Okay, fine. All right, all right. Okay, so we'll start with the valedictory address directly. Let me introduce Dr. Hugo Cardozo. Dr. Cardozo is a professor of linguistics at the University of Lisbon and a researcher of the Portuguese lexified Creole languages of Asia. His PhD project consisted of the documentation and description of the Creole of Diu, after which he replicated this research in South India and Sri Lanka. He is the author of several articles and academic publications, including Factoring Socio-Linguistic Variation into the History of Indo-Portuguese and The Case of Addressees in Dravido-Portuguese. Dr. Cardoso is a contributor of the Atlas of Pidgin and Creole Language Structures, University of Oxford Press, and editor of various books. Since 2013, he is a researcher at the University of Lisbon's Faculty of Arts, having previously worked at the University of Coimbra, University of Macau, and University of Hong Kong. Dr. Cardoso will be speaking on Indo-Portuguese language contact in the Dravidian space. Over to you, Dr. Cardoso.
So we just have to make a few adjustments here to use a different computer.
After connecting this device, this device, yeah.
Mas há pouco tínhamos testado só com este, isso funcionou.
Sim, mas então isso vai para o projetor, está bem?
Tudo bem, sim, sim.
Um momento. Não sei. Se não funciona, então depois passamos. Yeah. Connecting or not, that, yeah. This is audio, huh? This is audio. This is from this device. Okay. Yeah. Já está?
Deve estar, mas não está a projetar.
Não duvidar, sim. Projector. No, we are trying with projector. We are not. We have disconnected this.
Aconteceu agora.
Apagou?
Apagou.
Yeah, it's here.
The audio is not working.
If we try to see how it is. Connect. No, this has gone off.
When you connected it, this went off. No, it seems okay.
It's not coming on?
No.
Power? You need power?
No. Okay, let's try come.
It's working? Just working? Just check the sound. Yeah. Check it.
Posso ligar?
Então uma frase por aqui. Evitando.
Tudo bem. All right, so finally I think we're ready to go ahead. We were hoping to do this during the break, but since there was no break, I appreciate your, your patience. Let me now finally, after in this morning I said I wouldn't have the time to do it, give my votes of thanks to everyone who's involved in the invitation to be here, all of the organizers, for inviting me to be here and also for giving me the honor of doing the valedictory of the last presentation. And a special thank you also to the CUNHA RIVARA chair, of which I've been a part of and a collaborator of for a few years, and who are sponsoring my stay here in Goa. So I thought I would use this final moment to try and shift our gaze a little bit away from Goa. Not that our shift has always been on Goa during these 2 days, but it has very much been on Goa, right? And so lest we assume that anything that has to do with the cultural interactions between Portugal and India is only reserved to Goa, let's move somewhere else, and let's move to a location, to an area. Of course, I'm going to be talking about linguistics because that's what I do, and I'm going back to the beginning in a sense, because the Dravidian space, by which we mean essentially southern India and eastern Sri Lanka, is essentially the location where linguistic contact between Portuguese and any language of Asia began, right, as you are probably aware. And I will try to explore a little bit what the consequences of this chronology are, all the while trying to show that looking beyond Goa can also be quite enlightening in this respect, and many others as well. So I'll be talking about Indo-Portuguese language contact in the Dravidian space. You will know, of course, what the chronology of the arrival of the Portuguese language in this part of the world is. It's essentially a phenomenon of the 16th century, which, and this is important, begins in what we now call the state of Kerala, so the Malabar coast in southwestern India. By focusing on not only the Malabar coast, Kerala, but also on Sri Lanka, which are two of the locations where I've been doing fieldwork myself, I'm also giving a nod to the convener of this conference, Professor Jackson, who's been an innovator, and he's really opened up research on these two areas, on linguistic contact, on oral traditions that involve the Portuguese or the arrival of the Portuguese in these two areas specifically. So this is dedicated to you as well. And besides, as I said, these are locations that I've been working with and which are also dear to my heart. And so one of the first things that I would like to draw our attention to, and we've talked a lot about exchange of lexicon. We've talked about linguistic loanwords, specifically with reference to Konkani. But actually, and I'm going to go back to Garcia Duarte for the third time in these 2 days, but actually one of the consequences of the fact that the original contact, or the initial contact, linguistic contact that is, was between Portuguese and the languages of Kerala, specifically Malayalam, what we now call Malayalam, and which the Portuguese at the time called the Malabar in very generic terms, means that initial moment of contact has provided some of the most enduring and most important strands of linguistic interchange. And that is made evident, symbolically at least. Of course, this is just the beginning, the initial moment, but the interaction between the Portuguese language and Malayalam, which was two-way, right? So both languages were impacted by this encounter. We can see the workings of this encounter. We can observe it precisely on the Roteiro da Viagem de Vasco da Gama da Índia. That is the report, the chronicle of the voyage of Vasco da Gama, because you're probably all aware of this document. You know that it describes, all of the various steps of the journey, the encounter with the Zamarin of Calicut, and the way back. But what's interesting for our purposes here is that at the very end of this document, which is now preserved in a library in Porto in Portugal, and it's an essential historical source, at the very end, there are these two pages, which are essentially a glossary of what they called the Malabar language. So this means that someone on the Armada of Vasco da Gama, some people say it was Cristóvão Velho, we can't be sure, but someone on the Armada decided to start learning a little bit of Malayalam. And whether they did that in Kerala or on the way back, because we know that on the way back there was at least one person who traveled back from the Malabar coast to Portugal. On one of these occasions, someone did a bit of linguistic elicitation. So this is what we have here. We have a list of a number of terms, common terms in Portuguese for which the equivalent in the Malabar language, that is Malayalam, is provided. Here's just a little bit, just a partial transcription of what this looks like. You have a term in Portuguese, like for example, olhar, which means to look, and then you have a term in Malayalam, written of course in a very haphazard manner, because this was really the first time that the language was being recorded using the Roman script. But this can be interpreted, and we can find out what the language, what the terms were that were being recorded. So it starts out immediately, and of course a lot of these terms didn't necessarily become absorbed by Portuguese, but some of them did. And I will draw your attention to this one here, which is the term for corda meaning a rope, and the term in Malayalam which is given on this very initial document is korau. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but this is actually one of the terms which did enter the Portuguese language, and it entered the Portuguese language with the form kairu, and then this will probably be familiar to those of you who speak English. It was transmitted from Portuguese into English as choir, and we still use the term choir for a coconut husk rope, right? So, we have an initial moment here which we can pinpoint. It was in 1498. It happened during this initial trip, which opens up the possibility of this lexical interchange, which, as I mentioned, went both ways. In fact, Malayalam is one of the languages in Asia which has absorbed the most Portuguese terms. Konkani, of course, is at the top, at the head of this count. But Malayalam and Tamil, for example, are high up there as well. But so was Portuguese. So Portuguese acquired a lot of terms from Malayalam, as it did from Konkani. And earlier today, we heard about the idea that Garcia Duarte provides, that a lot of the terms for herbs and spices and plants that he uses in his work came from Konkani, but he was also very much aware that a lot of it came from Malayalam. And that's quite clear in this section here, which is part of his description of the betel nut, the betel nut. And he says at some point about the name of the plant, he says, we call it betre because the first language that the Portuguese knew was the Malabar. Every name that you see which is not Portuguese is Malabar. That is not true, but this is his impression that he put out. Every name that you see which is not Portuguese is Malabar, and not just when it comes to plants. Just like betre, also chuna, which is whitewash, mainatu, which is a washerman, patamar, which is a courier, and many others. So evidently, even though the centrality of the Malabar to the entire imperial colonial enterprise of the Portuguese was short-lived and lasted essentially for the first few decades of the 16th century, the fact that that linguistic contact started there means that Malayalam had an opportunity to give an outsized contribution, at least lexical contribution, to Portuguese. Okay, so this is one of the dimensions of language contact, and we've talked a lot about it, about loanwords. The one I want to focus on, because it's the one I've been researching for a while, is what we call the Asian Portuguese Creoles, or the Luso-Asian Creoles. And by Creole, what we mean are languages which, as linguists, we tend to consider separate languages and not varieties of another one. Which are the result of intense linguistic contact. And the fact that the Portuguese language arrived in Asia, not just in Asia, but in many parts of the world throughout the 16th century and created roots which were more or less deep, depending on the subsequent history, means that a lot of these varieties developed, which have Portuguese as one of the donor languages, and then the local languages, whatever they are, as the other donor languages. These are, in the case of Asia, these are the varieties we call the Luso-Asian Creoles. This map will give you an idea of where these languages used to be spoken in the past. The map is not complete, so there are a lot of places which are not here, but at least it gives you an impression of how wide the phenomenon was, how coastal the phenomenon was, and also how much there was a concentration in South Asia, which is something that interests us here. Now, these varieties are no longer all spoken. You will probably be aware of that. A lot of them have died out. But we still have a few that we can access and that we can research. Now, if we zoom in on South Asia, we come to the group of these languages which traditionally have been called Indo-Portuguese. And Indo-Portuguese is a generic term for this group of languages, encompassed not just what we call Indian nowadays, but the whole of South Asia, including Sri Lanka, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, parts of Bangladesh, and eventually even parts of Burma, Myanmar. This map is a little bit more detailed. So on this map I tried, which was created a while ago for my PhD thesis, I tried to include as many places as I could find where there's a reference to the use of a language which is either Portuguese or a variety of Portuguese. And in some of these cases, we know that these are Creole languages because they're really quite distinct from Portuguese. This is again the maximum dispersal, let's say the maximum implantation, because if we look at the situation nowadays, you will see that the map becomes a lot shorter. These are the varieties which are still spoken, and I'll make reference to all of them in my presentation. You have a variety spoken in Diu, one in Daman, one in Korlai, which we've just heard about this morning as well. Kannur or Kannur in the north of Kerala. You will see Cochin with a strike through, and there's a reason for that. The reason is that when I started doing my research in Cochin about this language, back in 2006, I was still able to find the person who appears to have been the last speaker. So I made recordings, I created a little corpus, and I made all sorts of gatherings and elicitation with this gentleman who was called William Rosario. But then in 2010, he passed away. So if it is true that no one else actually is a fluent speaker anymore, then perhaps this variety, which may actually have been the oldest out of all of these, died out in 2010. And then there's Eastern Sri Lanka, where I've been also conducting a project of late, especially centered around the cities of Trincomalee and Batticaloa. But I've had to add Jaffna in the north of Sri Lanka to this map, which was not there originally, because the received wisdom was that the variety of Jaffna was long gone, was no longer spoken. But during our project in Eastern Sri Lanka, we were actually able to identify speakers in Jaffna. So Jaffna is back on the map. Now, these languages that you see represented here are not necessarily very similar to each other. And I will show you some examples which I think will clarify that. And one of the reasons why they might diverge a little bit between themselves is that the languages that they are in contact with and which therefore were important for their formation and development are different as well, right? So in Diu and Daman we have Gujarati, in Korlai we have Marathi, and then this is what interests us in the south of India and in eastern Sri Lanka, you have Malayalam and Tamil. So the Dravidian space. And based on this insight, from very early on, the first people to deal with these languages have decided to separate them into clusters. And one proposal that comes from Ugo Schuchart, a German linguist from the late 19th century, who was the first one to work on these languages in a scientific, professional way, he divides them like this. So he calls Goro Portuguese all of the varieties that were developed in contact with Indo-Aryan languages or Indo-European languages, and he calls Dravido Portuguese the varieties that were developed in contact with the Dravidian languages. What are the varieties of what he called Dravido Portuguese which are still spoken? Well, essentially the one of the Malabar, Kerala, and Sri Lanka. The situation in the Malabar, as I have shown you, is that there are a few speakers in Kannur, essentially 6, maybe, because the data is a little bit outdated and I haven't been there in a while to check the situation. Perhaps 1 speaker in Calicut, so these are people I interviewed a few years ago, and as I just explained to you, the variety of Cochin appears to have become extinct in 2010 with the passing of Mr. William Rosario. This variety, for those of you who have never contacted it, sounds like this, and I hope the sound will work. Okay, So this was Miss Rita Neto from Cananor telling me at the beginning of a story. And I guess for those of you who speak Portuguese, it may not have been immediately clear what was being said, because in fact, and this is what's interesting about these languages, is that they really do diverge a lot from Portuguese, and that is the result of the contact that they've been sustaining for many centuries. The other variety is Sri Lanka Creole, Sri Lanka Indo-Portuguese, which, as I mentioned, is now spoken especially on the East Coast around the cities of Batiklo and Trincomalee and a few other locations around them, also in Jaffna, but by only a handful of speakers. We know that there are over 800 speakers. I forgot to translate Falantes into speakers for some reason, although the exact number of speakers is unclear. And this is the result of a research that we did as well to find out what's the vitality of the language nowadays. And it sounds like this. In this case, we have a video. All right, so this was Miss Filomena and Miss Juliana telling me about the wedding traditions of their community, which is locally known as the Burgher community, or to be specific, the Portuguese Burgher community. These are two communities that our convener has worked on, so he knows the field very well, and he knows these languages very well. Now, when I started doing research about these languages, the variety of the Malabar of Kerala was really not well known at all. It hadn't been researched, but the one of Sri Lanka was. Had been, so there was information about it. So when I started working on the Malabar, the first thing that struck me is that it resembles a lot of what we already knew about Sri Lanka. And I've been exploring the idea that these two varieties, let's say the Dravidian space, or the varieties developed in the Dravidian space, constitute a cluster on linguistic terms, right? So there are enough similarities, linguistic similarities between them to posit or to try to, pose the question of why. Why is that so? I'll try to show you how, what's behind this idea by showing you a few examples of these languages and contrasting them to the varieties of Indo-Portuguese Creole spoken in the north, Daman, Diu, and Korlai. Starting with these two from the Dravidian space, one of the first things that sets them apart is the basic word order of their sentences, and specifically that the verb comes last. Now, this will not be, so the object comes before the verb necessarily. This will not be very surprising to those of you who speak essentially any language from South Asia, because this is the dominant word order of these languages. But when it comes to the Creoles, which were developed here, only the ones from the south have this feature. Here are the examples, and so that you can follow what's going on, I have colored in blue the objects, and in red the verb and whatever other elements need to be attached to the verb. So in Malabar and the Portuguese, if you want to say they would send it to Mysore, you would say o outro aquele Mysore lo manda. Aquele is the object and the verb comes at the end. The same thing in Sri Lanka, and this example is from Ian Smith, who was the first one to do a lot of recordings and linguistic description of this variety in the 1970s, to say his daughter doesn't know Portuguese, and Portuguese is what's interesting for us here. You would say, o ser se fia pa português no que se va. Português the object, and then the verb phrase, let's say. Now contrast this with the other Creoles, and you will see that the situation is not the same. With the exception of Korlai, because what happens in Korlai, and that is apparently the result of the growing impact of Marathi on Korlai, recent impact, let's say, is that in Korlai you can do the two orders. You can do object-verb and you can do verb-object, right? So if you want to say Teru is looking at the book, you can say Teru ulyan book, and this would be verb-object, and you can say Teru book ulyan object-verb. So it seems like Korlai is transitioning between South Asian-like syntax and European-like syntax, and there are reasons for it we can discuss later if you're interested. But when it comes to Daman Indo-Portuguese and Diu Indo-Portuguese, the word order is like in Portuguese with respect to this. So you have the verb and then the object. So in Daman, if you want to say he took all of that and sold it, Então, ele tomou tudo aquilo. Tomou is the verb, tudo aquilo is the object. And in DU, I sent one present to my sister. Eu mandou, this is the verb, and then you have the object. Um presente a minha irmã. Okay? Second example, the last one, because I do not want to bore you with this, but this is quite interesting as well. Relative clauses are these, subordinate or embedded clauses which modify a noun. And in European languages that you might know, what you have is that you have the noun that they modify, and then in front of it or after it, you have the clause. And the clause is introduced necessarily by something, a relative element, which kind of substitutes, replaces the element that's being relativized within the clause. So that's the European way of constructing relative clauses. It's not the South Asian way of constructing relative clauses. And in Malabar Indo-Portuguese and Sri Lankan Indo-Portuguese, what you have is that the relative clause comes before the thing it's modifying, and there is no relative element within it. Okay? So to say the horse that I bought, or the horses that I bought, in Kannanur you would say eu pedi cavalo. Cavalo is the horse, right? Eu pedi is the sentence, the clause, the relative clause that modifies it. Comes before, and there's no relative pronoun, no relative element. Same thing in Sri Lanka. The folly that these two people committed that day, folly is kumedi, it comes here, and it's modified by isti dos pesam, okadia jafaya kumedi, right? So the same order. Korlai, Daman, Diu, they do not function like this. They follow the European order, even though, and there's even necessarily a relative element within the clause, even though in some cases that relative element doesn't have to come at the beginning, which is something the Portuguese would not allow, but happens here. For example, in Korlai, the man whom Mary saw yesterday, the man, Mari ont kiuyo, this is the relative clause, but the relative element comes within it and not at the beginning of it. Okay? Same thing in the man, same thing in Indio. So when it comes to syntax, you have this clustering, which you can see with these examples, and I could give you more. Why would these two varieties, those of Kerala and those of Sri Lanka, have these similarities and contrast so much with the other varieties? Well, one possibility which has been proposed by Ian Smith is the one that you have here. He says that the language introduced to Sri Lanka by the Portuguese was undoubtedly a variety of Pidgin Portuguese which had been shaped by their contacts with the peoples of the west coast of India. So the idea that whatever happened earlier, potentially in Goa, but most likely in the Malabar, was what was transferred into Sri Lanka. Indeed, Sri Lanka Portuguese shares many structural traits with other varieties of Indo-Portuguese, although some of these similarities may be due to parallel development caused by the influence of traits common to the languages of the South Asian linguistic area. So this is the other possibility, that they are similar because the languages they're in contact are also similar. Also, the possibility cannot be ruled out that innovations in Sri Lanka were carried back into the Indian dialect. So, these communities are influencing each other, not necessarily always in the same direction. So when it comes to things like the word order, syntax, etc., the impact of the local languages could be a reasonable explanation for their similarities. So that's why I want to show you now something that has to do with words, and specifically the selection, let's say, if we can use that term, of particular etyma from Portuguese in these different groups. So here we have, I'll show you a number of examples, but this is how it works. Here you have the term for whatever I'm going to show you in the Malabar, in Sri Lanka, right? So the southern cluster, the Dravidian area, and then you have Korlai, Daman, and Diu, and we'll see that in all the examples I will give you, these two cluster together, and they are different from what happens in the other varieties. The first one is the subordinator if, so the word for if, which in these two is sana and sara, potentially derived from Portuguese senão and not from Portuguese se, which is what you find in the others, right? She, se, si. Second one, the way to say after. It's all from Portuguese depois, essentially, but there is a crucial difference because in the Malabar you have dispose or expose, in Sri Lanka you have dispose, and then in Korlai you have depai, depai. So there is an additional S which you find here, which shows you that actually the etymon in these cases is not depois, which is the standard in modern Portuguese, it's despois, right? Another example, how do you say when? So the element that you introduced to say when. There's a number of different ways, but there's one which is only used in the southern varieties, and this is orze or horas, which is a reinterpretation of horas, which means hours. So you take hours and you turn that into something that means when, okay? Doesn't happen in the others, where you have cor, quan, coming from que hora, what time, or quando, when. One more. How do you say because of? These two, suida and vida, may not look like they're necessarily similar, but they are. I've written a paper about this. And the source is the expression por via de, or rather via de, meaning by way of. Whereas the other varieties have different sources. Rapad is actually from Marathi, and Daman and Diu have pukaus, which comes from por causa, because of. The demonstrative to show something close to you, what we call approximate, is from este, in these two varieties, and it's from esse, yes, ye, in the other varieties. The way to negate a sentence, the element that you use to negate a sentence, there's a number of different ways, which usually come from não, which is the most common one in Portuguese. But what's special about these two is this nunca and nuku, which have the same function, but they are derived from Portuguese nunca, which means never, right? So there's another reinterpretation of a Portuguese etymon here. And finally, the way to say another one is indong, in both of these, ainda still one. Whereas there are different options, mais plus one, or outro, another, in the other varieties. So these were, grammatical elements. I will quickly show you some lexical elements, so ways of referencing things which function in the same way or cluster in the same way. The way to say dog is cachorro in the south, comes from cachorro, and in the other ones it's cão, which comes from cão, so different sources. The word for a friend is camrad or cambrade in the south. It comes from camarada, comrade. And in the other varieties, it comes from amigo, friend. The way to reference language is linguae or lingvai, which comes from Portuguese linguagem, language, in the more technical term, you could say, in a more technical way. Whereas the other varieties derive it from lingua, which is a more common and shorter, as you can see, source. Room, the name for a room is camera or cambra, from camera, chamber, in the south, but it has different sources in the other varieties. The name for a Tamil or a Malayali, it's the same thing in both of these locations, is malvar. Malvar is used in both of these varieties to reference either the Tamils or the Malayalis or the Tamils. And the other varieties do not have this term because they usually don't reference Malayalis or Tamils. And the way to say to think in the southern varieties comes from the Portuguese verb lembrar, which literally means to remember, right? So there's been, again, a reinterpretation, a resemantization of it, whereas in the other cases it comes either from Marathi, in the case of Corlai, or from a different Portuguese verb pensar, which does mean to think. This way, this side can be expressed with istonda, which comes from esta banda, this side, in the south, but not in the others. And finally, the way to say well, that something is well done, for example, is befit or befende, which comes from bem feito, well done, in the south, but it comes from different sources in the others. Boni, meaning from boni to beautiful in Corlai, and bem or bem from bem, good, well, in the other varieties. Right, because I'm running out of time, I will just mention this final idea just so you can linger on it, but I will not develop it. I think we are on reasonably safe grounds to say that there must be some historical reason why these varieties of the South are so similar, right? But the other consequence of looking at the Dravidian space when you were talking about Indo-Portuguese language contact is that you have to admit what I've just said a while ago, that the Malabar, so the place of initial contact, and specifically the contact between Portuguese and Malayalam, may have had a foundational role, let's say, in this history, which can be still perhaps observed elsewhere. And that's because the diffusion took this route, right? So first the Malabar, and then from the Malabar expanded into other places. This is an idea that's been around. It's a hypothesis which we call the primacy of the Malabar in linguistic studies. And there have been some proposals that perhaps, when you look at Asian Portuguese Creoles elsewhere, even in Southeast Asia, some of the features that you find repeatedly may actually have been developed in the Malabar. And one of them is, for example, this, the fact that when you want to indicate possession of something, what we call a possessive construction, you use an element which is either su or sua or sua, coming from Portuguese sua, which is postposed to the thing or person that possesses, right? And it's preposed to the thing that's possessed. And this is completely contrary to how Portuguese works, right? Now, the interesting thing is that you find that in Korla, in Batiklo, in Malacca, in Batavia, in Bidao, everywhere, except for Dio and Daman, everywhere, even when the local languages do not allow you to understand this development as being something local, like, for example, in the case of Malaysia, where Malay does not work like this. So if you find it, you have to posit that there must have been some sort of transfusion of this particular construction, right? And the Malabar is actually a good place to look for it, because Malayalam functions like this. So it would have made sense that this initial contact variety, which developed as soon as the Portuguese arrived on the Malabar, would have developed this, and then that this would have been transported, via the sea routes, the trading routes, to other parts of Asia, and lasted to this day in these languages. And with that, I will show you the references, and thank you again for your attention. Can I just switch on? No, this one is my other picture.
Thank you, Dr. Cardozo, for that very fascinating and eye-opening presentation on the symbiotic relationship between Portuguese and the Dravidian languages and Creoles. I'm sure many of you are itching to, respond to that presentation or to ask questions, which I'm sure you'll get a chance to do over tea once we are done with the valedictory session. So at this point, may I request Mr. Franz Schubert-Cotter to accompany and escort the dignitaries to the dais. Of course, we would like you back on the stage, Dr. Hugo Cardozo. Yes, I should have signaled to you to take your seat there. And of course, the convener of this conference, Professor Kenneth David Jackson, the co-conveners, Professor Anuradha Wagle, Dean, SHENOI GOEMBAB School of Languages and Literature, and Professor Koshi Tarakkan, Dean, School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies. Let's give them another round of applause. Before I give Ma'am Wagle a chance to settle down, may I request her to come up here and should I invite Mr. Koshi first? Okay. Okay. I'm going to ask Professor Koshi Tarakkan, Dean, School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, and co-convener of today's event, to share his thoughts about our 2 days deliberation.
Good evening, everyone. We have reached the last session of this wonderful 2-day international conference. Well, I wish to begin with a small note by the philosopher Bimal Krishna Matilal, who in his work, Confrontation of Cultures, observed that philosophically it is not very interesting to note that there are a staggering variety of cultures, subcultures, subgroups in this globe of ours. But what is philosophically significant is to note how these groups relate with each other or confront one another. Well, in the last 2 days, what we have seen is such a nuanced ways of interacting, relating, confronting different cultures, or the presentations of various learned scholars that were made here. Well, again, to think about such cultural differences, or maybe to the extreme of claiming kind of a cultural relativism, I wish to point out what philosopher Feyerabend once mentioned, that potentially every culture is all cultures. I would add a qualification insofar as we allow, following Simmel's formulation of the stranger, that a stranger is precisely a stranger because he was not part of the group from the beginning, but then he brings to the group qualities which were not originally there in the culture, which could not have stemmed from the group itself. That's how a stranger becomes part of a culture, a wider culture. In other words, even a stranger is part of one's home world. I mean, all these kinds of philosophical nuances I could see through various presentations, be it on art, expressions of art, architecture, language, linguistics, culture, various other shades of culture in the last 2 days. Well, again, before I conclude my opening remark, I think it's appropriate to invoke what in the opening presentation by Professor Ganeri mentioned about the distinction between avatara and avatar, in the sense that this seminar had a previous avatara last year in a different format, where University of Toronto, where Professor Ganeri is the distinguished professor, who is also a visiting research professor at Goa University, mooted the idea of having a seminar on Fernando Pessoa, in which Professor Kenneth Jackson also took part. So over the last 1 year, I could see how something which began in a small scale now took a larger avatara, and I hope next year it may take even larger avatara, thanks to the initiative of Toronto, University of Toronto, Yale Macmillan Center, Goa University, and various schools like SHENOI GOEMBAB School, and of course my own school, SSPS. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Koshi. I now request Professor Anuradha Wagle, Dean, SHENOI GOEMBAB School of Languages and Literature, and co-convener of this conference, to give us her valedictory report.
Two difficult tasks in one single day. This has been this is really very overwhelming for me as I present the report of this conference. This two-day conference, which was conceived about a year ago and then developed during the year and finally culminates today, is a collaboration between Goa University, the two schools, the SHENOI GOEMBAB School of Language and Literature and the School of Philosophy, Sanskrit and Indic Studies, and the Macmillan Center in Yale. We are indeed very privileged to have this collaboration, and I want to thank Professor Kenneth Jackson for having, mooted this idea and saying, he wrote a lovely letter to me some months ago saying that let's go ahead and let's do this, and it'll be really something very, very fascinating and very good. So with this, this conference came into being, and we got the support also on the side of the JOAQUIM HELIODORO, the CUNHA RIVARA chair. We got the support of Institute Camões, and of course the visiting research professors program of Goa University, which also came forward to make this event totally complete. And so I now go ahead with my report. You must imagine that the 2 days and the days preceding these 2 days have completely led me to a brain fog in some ways. I have to now compartmentalize all the information which I have gathered here, and so much of it. So please forgive me if I do make any errors. I will try not to. So we started with the keynote address by Dr. Kenneth Jackson, David Jackson, which was an exhaustive repertoire of Goan studies in an international perspective. And this set the tone, really set the tone for this conference. This was followed by the book release, in a way, the presentation of the book by Professor Janardhan Ganeri, whom we are happy to have in Goa University as a visiting professor. And this brought into perspective both Indian and Western, both the Indian and Western philosophy, with special reference to Fernand Pessoa. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think I got that. It was truly fascinating, thank you. Our first panel then looked at crossroads of thought, Indo-Portuguese history and society, through 4 fascinating presentations. The first by Dr. Rosa Maria Perez, who enthralled us with the presentation on the Ganesh Studios and its owners, the Navelkar brothers, and showed us how the importance of photographs as archival documents. The second presentation was an excellent expose on the French diaspora, the Goan French diaspora, and the Portuguese influence that facilitated the integration in France. The third presentation by Dr. Edward S. Cook, Jr. Showcased the marvels of Goan carpentry inspired by regions along the Portuguese sea routes. This session was very ably chaired by Professor Lakshmi Subramanian. The roundtable on the Indo-Portuguese artistic expression of palimpsest and visual discourse, which followed, started with the presentation actually by Sachin Chatte, because I think we went backwards, but let me start with Isabel de Santa Rita Vaz, who spoke about her translation of Orlando Costa's play, Saint-Flourish Necoroche, and the challenges that it presented while translating this very difficult play. To translate, I will not talk much about it. I hope all of you are there tomorrow at 4:30 in the chemistry auditorium for where this play, an abridged version of this play, is going to be staged. Nalini Elvino de Souza then delighted us with showing us the evolution of a Brazilian song that has found its way into the Konkani language, and the way it has evolved from what it was originally to what we know today. Dr. Architect Alinto Coelho, right? Engineer, sorry. Alinto Coelho took Dr. Edward Cook's presentation forward by showcasing specimens of Goan architecture and artifacts that depicted cultural influences of Portugal. Last but not the least in this roundtable was Sachin Chatte's presentation, which provoked an animated discussion amongst the audience, while he presented or talked about Goa in Bollywood. And I think that was really something where the audience was truly enthralled, because this topic resonated with most of the people sitting in this audience. This session was moderated by Dr. Frederick Noronha. Then we came to the second day of this very interesting and enthralling journey. And this year we saw the first panel on spoken territory tapestries, Indo-Portuguese linguistic connections. Again, we had Dr. Hugo Cardozo along with Lorraine Alberto, who presented this was absolutely, before I speak about it, this was absolutely a discovery for most of the people sitting here. And of course, it was known to some, but unknown to many. And whether it was the syntactic features of Goan Portuguese or a peek into the Portuguese Marathi Creole of Vasai and Korlai by Professor Cecilia Carvalho, or the mutual influences of Portuguese and Konkani with reference to the lexical perspective in particular by Mr. Oscar de Nerona, or the story of Suryaji Anand Rao set in the 19th century Estado da Goa. This all came together as a new perspective, if you say, to language studies, and I hope many sitting here are inspired by these talks to take this work ahead. The second round table was on Page and Port, Indo-Portuguese Myth and Literature, where we had Dr. Father Eufeminiano Miranda, whose expose on Indo-Portuguese literature, highlighting the themes that are found in this literature, made an interesting presentation on this, which was then followed by Ms. Sheila Jayavant, who delighted us with a story of a marriage between Edila and Pundalik Gaitonde and the cultural challenges of living in a village and integrating into a conservative family. And, so this was truly interesting. We also had Dr. Anil Kumar Yadav here, who spoke about the role of translators in cultural exchanges and the importance of translation as a discipline to promote bilateral and multilateral engagement between countries. We had our moderator, Mr. Damodar Mauzo, who took it upon himself to complete the title of this round table, which was about literature and myths, and he said there was not enough said about myths. So he's talked to us about some of the myths that stand at the intersection of the two cultures in question. The last panel of the day was a panel on Indo-Portuguese literary imprint, where Dr. Sharmila Pais took us through the through the captivating world of theatre in Goa, highlighting the Western influences on 19th century Goan theatre, music, and dance. Dr. Rama Murkunde, assistant professor in Konkani, I'm happy to say the only participant from the Konkani discipline here, who spoke about the depiction of Portuguese rule in Konkani novels with reference to Paklo, Yug Savar, and Vodleghar. We then had Dr. Inez Lacerda, who, this was like a sequel to the first session where we saw the other side of what it was, from the oral to the written. And she presented Edila Gaitonde's book, Masson Azuif, excuse me if I pronounce that wrong, which is Blue Apples. And then we finally, we had our own Rochelle Fernandez, who spoke about reconstructing the social histories of slavery in colonial Goa through Joseph Hurtado's Golden Goa, based on the diaries of a Spanish Dominican priest and